You've heard the stories of bloody murder and horrendous homicide. But what about the rest of the crimes people fall victim to every day? What about the burglar who broke into famous people's homes? What happened to the forensic chemist that falsified evidence? Who are the fraudsters, arsonists, stalkers, hackers, and more? I'm Lindsay, the host of Mugshot. Mugshot is a true crime podcast bringing you stories of the non-murderous crimes you didn't know you needed to hear. Be sure to find Mugshot on your favorite podcatcher and on all social media outlets at the handle @MugshotPod. But until then, stay out of trouble, or you may end up pictured in your very own mugshot.
Murder and Such contains true stories about murders, the macabre, true crime, serial killers, and other dark subject matter. This includes adult themes, explicit language, descriptions of gore, violence, and other information provided by news articles, witness testimony, and public record. Murder and Such is not intended for all audiences, and although warnings will be set in place, listener discretion is still advised.
And exhale. All right. Well, thank you for being here. My 2 weeks off was somewhat refreshing, and I did get to unwind a little bit. Except for if you look at my social media stuff, you saw that I had 2 teeth pulled because, as I've always said, my teeth are a hot dumpster fire. But work has been somewhat still strenuous, but I'm glad to say that I'm finally back with episode 60. So thank you for understanding, and to everyone who reached out to me after the release of the Breathe episode. I may take that one down eventually, but when it comes to the show, I know this is the best way to reach each and every one of you lovely people to let you know kind of what's going on. So thank you for understanding, thank you for encouraging me to take a small break, and thank you for your extremely kind words. Hopefully I won't have any delays in future episodes. And also, a big thank you to Brad, Greg, and Jessica for wanting to research an episode for me so I could take an even longer break. Honestly, there's a lot of time and effort that goes into each and every episode of Murder and Such, and to say that it's daunting would be the very least. I can honestly say that about 30 to 40 hours of research goes into each and every episode, because since the show is now solo and a lot more serious, I'd rather give you the facts rather than plagiarize someone else's work or let 911 calls and interrogation audio be the majority of the content. I enjoy telling you these stories, even though some of them are truly hard to ingest. But with that, it also warms my heart that I've gotten so much love and encouragement from you guys to keep up the good work. It humbles me that I can sit in the studio, record some stuff, and you guys take time out of your days to join me and look at some of society's most vicious monsters. So if this show takes off, maybe sometime down the line, I'll be looking into hiring a researcher, but for now, it's just going to be you and me. And trust me, I am sorry in advance. But as I do with every episode, I would love to give a shout out to my new patrons. And I don't know what it is, but I've got quite a few new patrons this episode. So a massive thank you to my new patrons, Ariella Velez, for joining the Patreon page. And another big thank you to McKenna Johnson for also deciding to join the Patreon page. A thank you to the lovely Emma Hoffbauer for donating to the show. A special thank you to a longtime listener of the show, Jen Tarrant, for joining the page. A thank you to Stacy Coles for deciding to join the Patreon page. And last, but most certainly not least, a thank you to Nicole Blauen for helping donate to the show. You guys help offset the cost of research, fill my ever-growing stomach, and help keep this shit show afloat. So thank you again from the bottom of my cold, dark, diabetic heart. I really can't explain how much even just $1 helps the show keep running and keeps the Murder and Such lights on. So again, thank you. And if you'd like to join the Patreon page, you can get the show early and ad-free for just $1. You can find that at patreon.com/murderandsuch. So thank you so much to my new patrons for helping out, as well as the rest of you who have stuck by me for so long. You're the absolute best, and I'll never be able to repay you enough for the love and support that you give me. So thank you. But you're not here to listen to me ramble for countless minutes and hours about how much I appreciate you guys. You're here to learn about the monsters that I've mentioned before. So without further ado, let's get into this one. Revenge. The dish that's best served cold, as some would say. We've all had the notion in the back of our minds. I think it's a thought process that supersedes any sort of mental composition. Let's say high school. You're unironically wearing your absolute favorite Rick Astley shirt to school, and let's say somebody laughed at it or called you a name for it. Sure, that might not set you off, but being ridiculed for something is a hard pill to swallow. What runs through your head? At first, you're startled that somebody would be so vicious towards something as minuscule as a shirt. But second, it settles in a little bit deeper. This is Rick Astley, Europe's most treasured pop icon, and anyone and everyone loves him. But a love that Rick reciprocates because we all know that he's never gonna give you up. But lastly, how fucking dare somebody make fun of your shirt? What kind of audacity does this person have to point a finger at you and to call you stupid? They've got to be out of their minds to be such a dickhead about it. So maybe the fleeting thought passes your mind about them tripping in the hallway. Or maybe someone coming to intervene and maybe help make fun of Senior Fuckface for a taste of their own medicine. What if it's something more violent? What if you had the thought of what it would look like or feel like to slam their head into a locker, shove them down the stairs, or engage in physical contact between your fists and their face? Where would you fall in this category? Do you have some violent tendencies? Sure, we've all had violent thoughts, even if it was just for a second. Whether it's wanting to hit, kick, punch, or shove someone, I'm not gonna lie, because I used to have a lot more violent thoughts that floated around my brain when it came to exacting my revenge. But knowing the fine line between having those thoughts and committing those acts are two completely different things. Let's bring up a case about something that practically all of us have been involved in lately. Right now, it's 2020. It's a new election year, and I would be remiss if I said that politics aren't a very polarizing topic. Whether you're independent, libertarian, Green Party, Democrat, Republican, or you could give two flying fucks about the political landscape, chances are that you have seen or engaged in public discourse about the way our government is currently acting. Sure, everyone behind a keyboard has somewhat of a sense of safety or maybe even anonymity, because we're all so interlaced and connected through the power of the internet, probably with somebody on the other side of this country. It's somewhat biased between fact, some fictions, some opinions, and some straight up lies. But how far do you have to be pushed in one way or the other to want to exact revenge on who you see as the bad person? Do you take action against them? Because one man did, and in a very similar way that this episode is about. From October 22nd to November 1st of 2018, a man by the name of Cesar Altieri Sayoc had constructed and mailed out poorly manufactured pipe bombs to anyone and everyone who was critical of President Donald Trump. But as I mentioned, they were poorly constructed and none of them detonated. His targets included the residences and office of former President Barack Obama, former Vice President Joe Biden, former Secretary of State Hillary Clinton, Senators Kamala Harris and Cory Booker, as well as Representative Maxine Waters. They also included former CIA Director John Brennan, ex-Director of National Intelligence James Clapper, billionaires George Soros and Tom Steyer, and an actor that you very well may know by the name of Robert De Niro. One additional package was also sent to the world headquarters of CNN in Atlanta, Georgia. The one thing that was really noteworthy was that some of the packages' return label stated that the packages were sent by Florida's 23rd Congressional Chair and former head of the Democratic National Committee named Debbie Wasserman Schultz, a ploy to get the recipients of the packages to open them without a second thought. But all of these packages, thankfully, did not detonate, and nobody was killed or hurt in the process. Some of the packages were found after he was apprehended by the authorities in Florida. Now, sure, we all have political disagreements, and it's another thing to go from having a favorite party to becoming radicalized and wanting revenge for political differences. Caesar's van was found to have been plastered on the inside and outside with a ton of anti-democratic and pro-Republican and Trump propaganda, giving more motive that his targets were most definitely being singled out for criticizing the president and the GOP as a whole. Caesar Sayoc has been charged with around 65 crimes in which he pled guilty to all of them. Those included illegal mailing of explosives, assaulting federal officers, interstate transportation of an explosive, threats against a former United States president and other federal representatives, and, of course, treason. He has been classified as a domestic terrorist, which, rightfully so. But his actions have been seen as conspiracies amongst people like Alex Jones from InfoWars, Candace Owens, Dinesh D'Souza, James Woods, and radio host Rush Limbaugh. But considering this guy's long-traced history of making Twitter threats to public officials, it's hard to say that this guy's actions were some sort of a false flag operation. But if you don't mind me inserting my personal opinion here, Alex Jones is a bona fide fucking idiot who also thought that the Sandy Hook shooting was a false flag operation in which he lost a lawsuit against the families for his blatant disrespect and tarnishing the memory of those 28 innocent victims and their families. But Caesar Sayoc will be spending the rest of his life behind bars, and rightfully so. But what if they had detonated and he had more blood on his hands? It kind of goes to show that he was not the smartest crayon in the tool shed. And yes, I meant to say it that way. Again, here's my opinion, but if you believe a single thing that Alex Jones says, you can't be all there, and the hamster on the running wheel in their brain probably died years ago. But he was no Ted Kaczynski, otherwise known as the Unabomber. Ted had received a BA in mathematics from Harvard University, but something had changed. His targets were somewhat sporadic as well, and not politically motivated. A campus police officer, the president of United Airlines, a computer store owner, an advertising executive, and a timber industry lobbyist. Some of them he knew personally. Some were people that he didn't, but he wanted to make them pay. But out of the 16 bombs that he sent to various peoples and places over the 18-year span, all but 2 had detonated, in which he ended up killing 3 people but injuring 23 more. Ted Kaczynski was incredibly smart, sometimes referred to as a mathematical prodigy, but still radicalized and wanted to exact his revenge. But this story isn't about Caesar Sayoc or Ted Kaczynski. This story is about a man exacting revenge against a justice system that he thought did him wrong. A man hell-bent on destruction with a plot to leave bodies in his wake. A man who was incredibly smart, but led to his own capture by one of the strangest means I have ever heard of. But as always, I thank you for being here. I thank you for sharing this episode with a friend. My name is Hunter, and you're listening to Murder and Such, and this is episode 60, Walter Leroy Moody, Jr. The majority of this information has been derived from the book called Priority Mail, written by Mark Winnie. Walter Moody Jr. was born on March 24th of 1934 in Rex, Georgia. He was the eldest of 3 sons. But from the time he was young, he was always known to have been a child who liked to tinker with things. I was kind of the same way, taking apart a CD player to see how it would function, or just messing around with some nuts and bolts. Also, like me, Walter's father was an auto mechanic, so there were plenty of tools, parts, and things to take apart and admire the craftsmanship of. Walter, or as his family would refer to him as Roy, was somewhat of a recluse. After the fact, his brother Bobby had stated that, quote, "Roy was always a loner. I wouldn't have any idea of who to tell you who might know him well." Which isn't necessarily a bad thing, but in Walter's case, when he doesn't have very many close friends or confidants, there can be some sort of, let's just say a monster growing beneath the surface. Walter grew up and eventually had graduated from Peach County High School with just his general education and not really any solid plans for college. His grades were slightly above average, and he thoroughly enjoyed working in industrial technologies classes, and, like the Unabomber, he also had a fascination with mathematics, and he was known to have a great interest in different languages. But he didn't go off to college. He actually decided to enlist in the United States Army and spent most of his time being a message traffic analyst. Now, to those who may not know, a message traffic analyst is someone who analyzes incoming transmissions between enemies that can be intercepted, decoded, and translated to try to get the upper hand on the opposing forces. He was very fluent in this, even if his social skills amongst his fellow commanders and soldiers were greatly lacking. He then went to join the Army Reserve in 1956 and stuck with that for 3 years before joining the Air Force in 1959, in which he remained with them until 1961. He left the Air Force without any incidents. He served his country, served it well, and nobody really had any complaints about him as far as his conduct or his behavior. So after he finished up his service, he decided that he wanted to head back to school once again. So he enrolled in a community college to further his education and try to maintain a successful career. The first idea that he had was that he wanted to use his tinkering not on machines, cars, or electronics, but he wanted to become a neurosurgeon. Now, I'm not one to sit here and shit on someone's hopes and dreams for what they want to do in life, but after listening to this, you'll understand why him becoming a neurosurgeon might have had a different reasoning behind it. But I digress. Becoming a neurosurgeon is no easy task at all. You almost need to have immaculate scores, work day and night to prove yourself as a viable candidate who not only can understand the human anatomy, but exactly how the brain functions. Definitely no easy task, and unfortunately for Walter, he wasn't too proficient at it. His grades were slipping drastically, he sometimes wouldn't show up for class at all, and he started becoming more troubled as time went on. But later in 1967, he had a bunch of different things working for and against him. He was a smart guy, but he wasn't applying himself at school very well. He had found himself multiple women who were romantically interested in him, but a lot of them had become failed relationships after Roy's demeanor started becoming more and more troubled. So he actually did the right thing and started talking to a psychiatrist, which was a recommendation from his current girlfriend by the name of Hazel. So the psychiatrist who had been seeing him was a man by the name of Dr. Thomas M. Hall, and after the fact, he had a lot of very worrisome things to say about Roy. He started talking about how Roy was almost constantly paranoid, and he said that he was always afraid that he would end up in, quote, some sort of destruction against society, end quote. He had said in testimony that he knew that this monster was growing inside Walter was harboring a lot of violent tendencies. In all, Dr. Hall had seen Walter for around 40 different sessions throughout their professional relationship. As he later went on to say, it was the 1960s, and he felt more aligned with the ideologies and mindset that society was working against him, as he was now struggling to make ends meet, and a few of his relationships had ended, but then he found out that a couple of his exes were starting to see some African American men instead. That kind of hit him in the guts, considering this was also in the midst of the civil rights movement, and he was still in the South. Trust me, I'm not saying that everyone in the South felt that way, but to say that there weren't any people who felt that way would be a farce. This will definitely come up later in the story. It was said in Mark Winnie's book that, quote, "So far as anybody knew, Roy Moody did not belong to the KKK or any group more radical than the Experimental Aircraft Association. But Moody's record on race seemed no worse than that of millions of Southerners who grew up in the 40s and the 50s, end quote. However, nothing really bad happened to him after his evaluation. Sure, we all have some underlying issues, possible insecurities, self-doubt, depression, maybe anxiety, and there's nothing wrong with that, but acting on some violent tendencies is another thing. But Walter had found himself one who actually loved him and wanted to be with him. As I said, her name was Hazel, and she was young, kind, and willing to work with Walter on his issues and try to build a life with him. Granted, he had some school debt and he had gotten himself a new car, but there wasn't a whole lot of going on with Walter's life besides the fact that he had someone who supported him, in which they had gotten married in the late 1960s and even managed to have a son together. Just living the American dream. Meanwhile, suppressing the underlying evil within himself. Now that brings us to 1972. Walter had lost his job, and he and Hazel were having trouble trying to make ends meet. He had attempted to start his own business of a writers' club, but that was failing spectacularly. With the pressure surmounting him and his family and his house and trying to keep his head afloat, he eventually lapsed on his car payment for his fancy new MGB sports car, in which the dealership had come to actually repossess it. To say that this pissed off Walter would be a gross understatement. Cars are important, especially when you have a family. It's vital to the dynamic. It may be a sports car, but back in the early 1970s, everyone wanted themselves a cherry red 2-door sports car. It's almost like a sign of success, even if you're not very successful. But with that, his disdain for society was unraveling this onion of Walter's psyche and showing layer by layer the monster that resided within. So he started scoping out the car dealership to see if his car was there, in which it was. Repossession of not only this man's car, but his pride most definitely turned him violent. So he did what any person would do. He made himself a fucking pipe bomb. Of course, I'm joking. Nobody does that. But Walter found a fascination with explosives, and taking into consideration that Walter, after all these years, was still very much a tinkerer who liked to dabble in the more violent tendencies, he started thinking of ways to make a pipe bomb even more destructive. Particularly gunpowder tightly packed into a tube with other bits of shrapnel and using a light bulb filament as the igniter. But instead of capping the pipe with a screw-on cap, he instead affixed everything into the unit and welded the ends on, in which the ends were square sheets of metal to avoid the pipe rotating in the package and possibly breaking the filaments off in the process. It's worth noting that weld is a lot stronger than a screw-on cap, as a cap can be twisted off and on, but a welded cap would contain a lot more pressure inside before finally giving way and combusting. Walter, unfortunately, was no idiot with this, and he knew exactly what he was doing. So, May 6th of 1972, Hazel and Walter set forth a plan to head to Walter's mother's house the next day. But Walt, being a misogynistic asshole, was upset at the way that Hazel had done her hair. Obviously, something that he really shouldn't have any say over. This fight went on into the night, and the next day, Walter and Hazel sparked up the fight once again, which led Walt and his son to leave Hazel at home and drive to Fort Valley, Georgia to see his mom and leave Hazel behind in Macon. While he was there, he got a phone call that there had been an accident back at home, and the accident was one of his own doing. Walter made the pipe bomb and placed it inside of a package that was addressed to the car dealership with an extortion letter. Even some of the smartest people can be complete fucking idiots sometimes, because Walter, instead of hiding it somewhere, had left it on his workbench that was inside of the kitchen. So when Hazel was at home, she found the package, and she wanted to know what Walter was sending to the dealership that just repossessed his fancy new sports car. So she opened it, and off went the filament, which exploded this pipe bomb and left Hazel in critical condition. But since the tires weren't great on his own car, he borrowed his mother's car and sped not to the hospital in Macon, but to his own house to see what had happened. When he was later apprehended, he was quoted by investigators when they had asked him why he went to his house first. He had said, quote,
"Just to look at the room. You would think that it would just be bloodstains on the wall, but when you started cleaning it off, you see that there are thousands of tiny pieces of flesh blown all over the wall, and you couldn't wash it off. I had to get a bucket with soapy water, and I had to get a brush to scrub it. It got to be such a job, I realized the best way to do it was just to get everything out of there, so I moved everything that was in the room."
End quote. In all, Hazel had to undergo 6 separate operations to not only save her life, but to restore motor functions because the bomb that blew up had torn through her face, shot shrapnel through her eye, sliced and ripped through her thigh, shoulder, and almost obliterated her hand and left her with so many scars all over her body that it was by a sheer miracle that she wasn't killed by this explosion. His bomb and extortion note never made it to the car dealership, but just about killed the one woman who took a chance on him. He was arrested and charged with the manufacturing of an explosive device and federal mail charges for attempting to deliver an explosive via the United States Post Office. So Walter was arrested and held until October 19th of 1972, almost 6 months later, when he was acquitted of the manufacture of an explosive device, but convicted of being in possession of it. He was sent to the federal penitentiary located in Atlanta, Georgia, where he was handed down a 5-year sentence. And when he was in jail, Hazel had taken her son and divorced Walter, leaving him with practically nothing, which is most definitely what he deserved. This man had almost killed his wife. He's lucky he didn't get life behind bars. But at least she's been given the right to her son and the attempt at trying to move on, meanwhile holding back the physical, emotional, and psychological scars that this monster had given her. When it comes down to it, if you've done a crime and did your time, chances are you try to make a better life for yourself. That's what you hope someone would do. So during Walter's time in the clink, he started finding himself more in love with writing. Since you can't tinker with gunpowder and pipe bombs in prison, why don't you just start reading? So that's exactly what he did. He found himself reading a lot of books on law, creative writing, and even managed to get a few pieces under his own belt. This worked as a suppressor for his demon that still lay dormant. But let's just say that Walter was still somewhat racially biased. There was that sinking feeling about his exes who had left him and found interracial relationships after the fact. Then, when he was in prison, he was somewhat seen as a target for being the guy who tried to blow up his wife. Of course, he didn't intend to try to kill his wife, but kill a car dealer. But it's one person's word against the other when you're in prison. The African American inmates weren't kind to him. He was quiet, disassociative, kind of a book nerd, and above anything else, he was an easy target. So he started aligning himself with some of the not so friendly white people who were in the clink. Of course, doing this for protection. Sure, as I stated the quote from the book earlier, he was kind of racist. Full-blown white supremacist? I can't say that for sure. Didn't like African Americans? Yeah, he didn't care for them. I don't know where the needle falls between becoming one or the other, but his own shitty little brotherhood was indoctrinating him into their beliefs from the various groups such as the Southern White Knights, the Invisible Empire, and the Christian Knights. It's a dog-eat-dog world in prison, but he kept that hatred with him and kept looking more into his fascination with law. Reading articles from newspapers about possible injustices that were happening in the current events at the time, thinking of ways that he could subvert the law himself and act as his own defense in case something else were to happen, and other forms of twisting the laws of the land to fit his own personal motives. To the point where he was working with a defender to appeal his federal conviction and be released before the 5-year sentence was up. All of his attempts would prove unsuccessful, but after 3 years in prison, he was finally paroled and he was a free man. When he got out, he started going back to school. He first started making an attempt at working in law. There had been a lot of cases of ex-convicts who have decided to work either with rehabilitation or even become lawyers themselves. So he enrolled and he started working towards his law degree. That's not really a bad situation for somebody who's pretty smart like he is. Eventually, he did find himself a new girlfriend by the name of Susan, and things were good. For a while. Yeah, it's gonna take a pretty steep turn south. But when Walter was in jail, I mentioned his fascination with reading and writing. He was a bookworm and a sponge of information. Granted, they probably don't have very many copies of Mein Kampf while in prison for him to read like the Klan probably wanted him to, but he thought of a way that he could possibly make himself a new career and garner himself some money. He had formed his own business, which is pretty spectacular for an ex-convict, seeming to be on the right path towards honesty and success. Towards the end of the 70s, he formed a company called the Associated Writers Guild of America, which was a nonprofit but geared towards promoting up-and-coming authors, worked towards crafting writing skills, and it even offered to include excerpts of various writers around the country into a book called Authors to Watch for a nominal fee. So it would seem that he's looking to make ends meet and try to build a life for himself and his girlfriend. I wish I could say that the business was honest, but considering there were literally thousands of inquiries per month with the Better Business Bureau of Atlanta, it would seem that Walter was never really keeping his word. He accepted literally tens of thousands of dollars from various writers around the country to have their works published in his book and sent across the globe to get some sort of recognition, but Walter had no real interest in getting them published at all. It was almost some sort of late 1970s get-rich-quick scheme, to the point where in 1983 the postal inspectors recommended prosecuting Walter for mail fraud, but that never came to fruition. In June of 1990, the post offices actually took actions to close his shitty business down, but Walter was still appealing that case at the time, and of course, the nonprofit no longer exists to this day. Kind of a white-collar Bernie Madoff kind of crime if you ask me, but still shitty nonetheless. But in 1982, he started a new business venture as he felt that the authorities were closing in on his publishing scheme. This one was geared more towards something that gave him a lot more time to tinker. The business was called Superior Sale Drive Incorporated. that was in the business of researching and developing boat engines that were more fuel efficient and propellers that could help a sailboat traverse when there's no wind in the area back to their dock. This one would definitely land him in the hands of the authorities. All right, first of all, big oof. This is pretty fucking rough, and it's gonna sound a lot like some sort of movie plot, to be honest. I couldn't believe this when I was reading about it, but here goes. He started the company and he hired 3 people. One in particular was a man by the name of Warren Glover. He was an intelligent guy who had a master's degree in psychology and loved to take photographs. Well, Walter had a plan for him. That year, they had decided to head down to the Florida Keys to try and test out the new engine. From what it seemed, everything was working pretty well, and the engine appeared to be a successful invention. On one final outing, Walter had the idea of getting some underwater photographs of the engine itself that would ultimately help with the marketing of the engine. Again, it seemed pretty rudimentary. But the night before the final outing, a storm had hit the area, and the seas were particularly rough. Of course, when you're out on a boat in open water, you're probably going to be worried about drowning or if maybe there's some sharks in the water. But Walter insisted this would be the last time they'd head out before heading back home. So Warren and the other 2 employees by the name of Dan Feiderer and Tim Williams got on the boat with Walt and headed out about 4 miles into the ocean before finally dropping the anchor and prepping for the photographs. The idea was to take photographs of the propeller with Warren as the photographer, and the other 2 employees would be holding him underwater, acting as a temporary anchor. All of them were tied together around their belt loops on their pants, and that was tied to the boat itself as a safety precaution. Now this went off without a hitch, for a few times. But on the last time, Walter kicked the engine into full speed and had attempted to leave them behind in the open water, miles away from the coast. Immediately, all 3 men tried to grab onto the boat with the engine roaring. Most people would think to grab the men and try to pull them in, but Walter was screaming, "I can't hold it! I can't hold it!" And he pried the men's fingers off of the boat one by one, leaving them in open water and driving away. As Warren had testified, Walter had a deranged look in his eyes, and it was nothing that he had ever seen before, but when his fingers were loose, he felt that the lifeline rope that was supposed to be affixed to the boat had actually become loose or was cut, securing the fact that they were no longer tethered to any sort of floating vessel. As he drove off, the men witnessed him tossing the ladder to the boat inside of the ocean itself. Now, the men are tied together and they start to sink, so they all took off their pants while trying to keep their heads above water and ultimately separated with the waves crashing between them. Their employer is leaving them to die at sea. With the waves separating them, about 2 hours later, Tim had managed to drift backwards towards Warren and tried to get him to follow back. Warren had asked Tim where Dan was, and he had replied that he was located on an ocean channel marker that was located not really close by. Then Warren noticed that Tim was bleeding from a gaping wound on his head. When he had asked him what had happened, he had told him that he was also on the channel marker, but Walter had driven the boat up to it and told him that it was under control now, and coerced him to swim out back to the boat and get on. When Tim swam back out to the boat, he was greeted with Walter holding the anchor in his hand and then bludgeoned Tim in the head, then attempted to hold his head under water. At about the same time as Tim was telling him about this, they heard the sound of Walter's boat roaring nearby, but this time at full speed. He kept shouting, "Get on the boat!" But the boat wasn't slowing down at all. Tim separated from Warren and swam as fast as he could back to the channel marker. The first time that Walter had sped past Warren, ordering him to get on the boat, he had thought that he was just trying to get close. But then it finally clicked by the second or third time that he made a full speed pass at Warren that Walter wasn't trying to get him on the boat. He was trying to line up the perfect shot to run Warren over, hopefully catching his head with the propeller blade and killing him. Now, fortunately for Warren, this never happened, and he kept kicking and pushing himself off of the hole, meanwhile being left out in the open water. Walter had driven off and left him alone for another hour before finally returning. This time, he had enough of what he was trying and finally dropped the ladder that he had left at sea to the side of the boat and told Warren to get on. Warren, obviously being tired from waiting in open waters for over 3 hours, climbed onto the boat and then proceeded to punch the shit out of Walter for what he had just did to him. He then found a flare gun that had 3 flares inside of it and fired 2 of them towards the sky, arcing towards the Coast Guard that was at the nearby Fishbone Harbor. When Walter asked him if he was going to fire the 3rd round, he told him, quote,
"If you come towards me, the 3rd round is yours,"
end quote, and pointed the flare gun at Walter's face. When the Coast Guard finally made it to the boat, Warren had told the officer that Walter was trying to kill him and asked if he could get on the officer's boat. The officer directed Warren to take the boat back to Fishbone Harbor. When he arrived, he alerted the authorities to come and get Walter for his actions. Then, after a small statement, Warren had hired another captain to go and grab Tim and Dan, who had just been picked up by other sailboaters. When they returned, they all gave official statements to the officers. The sheriff's deputy had arrested Walter, had taken him to the local precinct, and he was booked for 3 counts of attempted murder, which was put on a federal status as opposed to local. Just another case of Florida man, if you ask me. Now, here's the question that you're probably wondering. Why would Walter want to kill the 3 employees that he had? Why would he drop an anchor on one of their heads, attempt to run over another one, and leave another one out at sea just to die? Walter's defense was that the waves were too rough, and since the engine was practically a prototype, and he had testified that the throttle had jammed, which led him to lose control of the boat. He did send out distress calls via radio to other places to come and rescue the other 2 men, but why would he even go to the lengths that he did to sabotage these men's lives and try to fucking kill them? Well, let's just say that this came from a reasoning as old as time. Life insurance. He took out 3 life insurance policies on each of the men for $750,000, in which, if they died, he was the sole beneficiary of. If they died in an accident on the job, he was looking to get himself $2,250,000 if they all perished. Luckily for these men, their survival instincts were on point and they all survived the attempted attacks. But unfortunately, despite the evidence that the prosecution had, the trial ended in a hung jury, and the men were only told that they should leave it as it is and never contact Walter ever again. The prosecution, considering the evidence and the fact the engine was indeed a prototype, had decided not to retry him for the case. This man had just gotten away with not 1 or 2, but 3 counts of attempted murder, and he still wasn't done. He had filed a federal lawsuit against the prosecutors, the sheriff's department, and all 3 of his former employees who he tried to kill for $1,550,000 for actual damages and the same amount for punitive damages, bringing the grand total to $3.1 million, citing that it was a malicious prosecution. One would think that if he had just gotten away with a federal charge of attempted murder, that you would just pick yourself up and try to keep yourself low. But no, It was another attempt at trying to get rich quick. At first, it was denied, citing that there was no evidence that it was malicious in any form, but the fact that a hung jury was the only reason he wasn't prosecuted, so he appealed that to the point where it made it to the 11th Circuit Court, which saw cases that involved Alabama, Georgia, and Florida, one that included a federal judge by the name of Robert Smith Vance. The case was ultimately fully denied, but let's get into why he never won that case and how Walter Leroy Moody tipped even further over the edge. On August 21st of 1989, according to the Associated Press, a suspicious package was discovered at the NAACP office in Atlanta, Georgia. Inside was not a pipe bomb, but a couple of canisters that had a small detonation. The package was quoted from Executive Director Earl Shinhoster, stating that it was no bigger than a hat box, but when it detonated, a tear gas canister had opened up and filled the office with caustic gas that burned the eyes and throats to anyone who came in contact with the substance. It was largely intact, but it injured 8 people who were rushed to downtown hospitals in Atlanta, which also included a 4-month-old infant and a 12-year-old child. Luckily, nobody was seriously hurt, but considering the NAACP, if you're not from America, the NAACP stands for the National Association of the Advancement of Colored People, which was established in 1909 to advance justice for African American citizens. So of course, considering the NAACP, this was treated as a hate crime. Earl Shinhoster was quoted saying, quote,
"This is a very evil and dastardly act. I don't know why anyone would want to try to hurt innocent people like this."
End quote. Now, the return address on the package was a law office, but that was believed to be a fake address as to avoid who could have actually sent it. But this sent shockwaves through Atlanta as a whole, and even included Representative John Lewis, who stated, quote, "Anytime something like this would come to the NAACP offices, you have to believe it's racially motivated. I think there's a climate existing in America now, 25 years later, the seeds of racism are raising their ugly heads again." But why would somebody target the NAACP? If you listen to John Lewis's statement, it sounded like a deliberate attack against African Americans, but that's never been Walter's MO. He made an actual bomb that maimed his former wife and landed him behind bars. But the package was constructed almost the same way, using batteries, some light gunpowder, and light bulb filaments as the igniter. Well, when something like this happens in 1989, you're going to hear it on the news, and to Walter, that was exactly what he was looking for. Considering Hazel had opened his package before he could send it through the mail to the car dealership, he didn't even know if he could send a package in the mail that would make it to its destination without it detonating first. But his tear gas canister that he had just made had actually made it through the mail, so he took that knowledge and turned it into his own lethal form of revenge. One that he sought to exact on a federal justice system that he felt had wronged him. So, as you know, I like to give somewhat of a disclaimer when there's going to be some gore coming. This is your disclaimer. This is very violent, but here goes. Saturday, December 16th of 1989, Birmingham, Alabama. A woman by the name of Helen Vance was getting prepped and ready for the upcoming holidays, wrapping presents, getting things arranged for her children to come home and spend the holidays with them. Her husband was the distinguished 11th Court Circuit Judge named Robert Smith Vance Sr. The one that I had mentioned was overseeing Walter's federal lawsuit and had already deemed it non-malicious. So Helen heard a knock at the door, and when she opened it, there were 2 packages that were left on her doorstep. One would never be named, but the other was sent to Bob Vance. Thinking nothing of it, considering they were prosperous and probably expecting a few things for Christmas, Helen brought the packages into the house and left them in the kitchen. Around 2 o'clock in the afternoon, Robert returned back home and saw that he had a package addressed to him sent by another judge on the 11th Circuit Court named Lewis Morgan. Nothing seemed out of the ordinary, and Robert Vance thought that Lewis was just sending him some more horse magazines, since he was a horse farmer and they were joking back and forth about having the horses eat the grass around Robert's yard as some sort of a makeshift lawnmower. So he had sent him magazines before, just as a little bit of a playful jab at Robert. But when he opened the brown and twine-wrapped box, he was greeted by a lid, but inside was not horse magazines or any sort of equestrian literature. Inside was a welded pipe bomb, filled to the brim with smokeless gunpowder and rubber bands that held nearly 80 finishing nails. The ends were square and welded on, and when Robert lifted the lid of the cardboard box and unfortunately completed the circuit, he caused the pipe bomb to ignite and sent shrapnel into Robert's face, stomach, and literally threw his body into the corner of the kitchen. Helen was also in the room, but Robert's body almost acted as a barrier between the blast and more shrapnel that could have ended Helen's life as well. Her stomach was severely lacerated, in which left a scar of an X on her stomach, as well as other pieces of metal, nails, and shrapnel that had embedded themselves inside of her skin and her liver. Helen was severely injured in the process, but when something like that just happens, your most primitive instincts will kick in, as well as adrenaline. She quickly ran to a bedroom and grabbed a towel, then she immediately went back to Robert. She took the towel and stuffed it against what was remaining of Robert's stomach. She tried to console him, still bleeding from her own wounds, and she held Robert as he took his final breath. From there, she tried to pick up the phone, but the blast was so violent that it disconnected the phone line in the kitchen, so she got into her and Robert's van and made a stop at a neighbor's house who unfortunately was not home at the time. She went to the next house and asked the neighbors, "Would you call the police? A bomb has gone off," in which they did. Then Helen returned back to the house and sat in her van as the police arrived, as well as an ambulance. But when they arrived, Helen already knew that they were too late, as the body of the love of her life, the husband that she had been growing old with, and the father of both of her sons was now lying in the corner of the kitchen. Robert was gone, and she was left with the question of, who would do this to him? After a few weeks in the hospital, Helen did make a full recovery, but the scars of the incident still remained. Of course, this brought the FBI, ATF, and others into the mix to investigate, and the investigations most definitely take time. When they found what was left of the bomb and some trace evidence of the pipe, the welded square caps, finishing nails, rubber bands, batteries, and all of the careful circuitry that was deliberately placed inside to ensure the maximum force of the intended explosion. But another thing was found, and this was particularly troubling. They found that most of the contents inside the package were coated in a thick, coal black enamel paint. As I've said before, Walter is no idiot. Walter knew exactly how to make the bomb and have it sent without leaving any sort of forensic evidence behind to give any sort of identifying signature, whether it be fibers, fingerprints, or any sort of DNA. That even included the stamps not using saliva to be affixed to the outside of the packaging, but using water and a sponge instead. But while the investigation was ongoing, the authorities notified anyone else who worked in the 11th Circuit Court to be wary of any suspicious packages that might be coming through their doors. Luckily for them, 2 days later on December 18th of 1989, the courthouse itself in Atlanta was taking x-rays of incoming packages, and they found one that looked particularly suspicious. Thankfully, they never opened the package, but completely evacuated the courthouse and called in the FBI and ATF, who ultimately showed up in bomb disposal unit gear. They didn't want the bomb to go off because that would get rid of any potential linkings between this bomb and the last one that they had just found, so they defused it instead. Now, on a personal note, I think that bomb disposal agents or BDU agents, whether it be male or female, the agents have the hardest fucking stones that you could ever imagine. Because your own life and potentially the lives of others lie solely in your hands. If you've ever seen the movie The Hurt Locker, you'd completely understand what I'm talking about. The agent who had defused the bomb was a man by the name of Bob Holland. When Bob had defused the package, inside he found a manifesto. The manifesto itself was talking about an upcoming war that was to be waged on the justice system. The paper was not written by hand, but it was typed with a typewriter, and then the copy that was sent to them was printed with it looked like a Xerox machine. The bomb itself was still coated in the thick, coal-black enamel paint, but not a shred of DNA evidence was to be found in or around the package that could link it to anyone who might have been in the criminal database. But their break will come from a very unlikely source, and one that Robert didn't even see coming. Now, Bob Holland had a lot of friends that he used to work with. One was a man by the name of Lloyd Irwin. Lloyd was pretty well versed in studying explosives and bombs, and when Bob had asked him about the bomb that he defused at the 11th Circuit Court, he started going into great detail about how the bomb was constructed and the key characteristics of the bomb that had square ends that were bolted on and then welded. And when Lloyd heard that, it solidified in his mind who that person might have been. Quote,
I know a person that has made a bomb of this style. I don't know where he's at, but I know he's got to be out of prison because it's been such a long time ago. His name is Roy Moody. It happened back in Macon, Georgia, sometime back in 1972.
They were lucky to intercept this package and defuse it without the bomb exploding, but that wasn't the only package that was received on that day. Nearly 250 miles southeast of Atlanta, another package had showed up to a lawyer's office in the town of Savannah, Georgia. A civil rights lawyer by the name of Robert Robinson, a young African-American attorney who worked closely with the NAACP on cases of injustice, a man who is dedicating his life to fighting the injustice and racial bias against the black community. But this man was a target to Walter. When he arrived at his office, he found that there was a package waiting for him. Sure, the news is reporting on Judge Robert Vance being assassinated in his own home, but that was concentrated primarily around the Alabama area. Robert Robinson had probably heard about this considering he also worked in law. But just like you or I probably get a package from Amazon or eBay on a monthly basis, he didn't think anything of it. Robert opened the package, and it sent him halfway across his office. The windows broke out of the building and alerted many people in the surrounding area, including an optometrist and friend of Robert's who worked across the street and came to his aid. He held Robert inside of his office until the ambulance came, but a lot of Robert's flesh had been ripped through by the flying shrapnel and burned by the fire that started setting legal documents and paperwork ablaze. Robert Robinson, a young, aspiring lawyer, would die 3 hours later in the hospital, now bringing Walter's death toll to a count of 2 victims. When the news broke out about the Savannah bombing, not only was the federal courts on high alert, but it also started reaching people who worked closely with the NAACP, including the office of a woman by the name of Willie Dennis. Willie was a 64-year-old woman who was the president of the Jacksonville, Florida branch of the NAACP, On the same day, she also received a package, but she was unable to open it, thankfully, because she was to attend a memorial service in Mims, Florida, where over a decade ago, 2 NAACP agents had been murdered. But here's the kicker. They were killed back then in a bombing. So she left the package on her desk and headed out to attend the service. She would have headed back to her office the same day, but as luck would have it, she was experiencing car issues and her vehicle ended up needing to be towed, and then she had to get a rental car. I mean, cars break down, and honestly, it's a stressful headache, but this headache might have been one that ultimately saved her life, as when everything was said and done, she took the rental back to her house and called it a day later that evening. But the next morning, she received a phone call from a friend who worked with her at the NAACP office and told her about Robert Robinson being murdered by a bomb sent to his building. Willie couldn't believe this, but it clicked in her mind that she had also received a package to her desk, but didn't have the time to open it or examine it closely. So she talked to another associate who had the keys to the building and instructed them not to go in as there was a suspicious package on her desk. She instead told them to stay out of the building and had called the Jacksonville Sheriff's Department, who then came and brought with the ATF. One of the agents was a man by the name of John Shedden, and he went to look at the package. But lucky for him, he also knew Bob Holland. So he called Bob and started asking him about the package that had shown up, and he was curious of any sort of characteristics that could help him potentially identify if this was a deadly package or not. Now, Bob had told him brown wrapping, a string tied in the center that overlapped, a red and white mailing label with a typed address, and the postage was rather neatly placed. He said that the bomb was constructed in such a way that it really could only be opened from one side, but inside of the box would also be 2 C-type batteries, a gray and red wire, and a pipe that was about 2.5 inches thick by 8 inches wide and was secured down by some sort of ties. Of course, the bomb was also fitted with square-shaped, welded caps. Now with that information, he headed to the office to check out the package, in which honestly, John thought that it wasn't going to be anything at all. But when he showed up, he was greeted by the exact opposite. A brown paper wrapped box with a red and white letter with a typed address and a string that ran through the middle. His worst fears had just come to life. He evacuated anyone who was in the building and told them that if they didn't get out, they would be arrested and their cars would be towed from the site. He stressed for them to get out, but not to make or induce any sort of a panic, which is kind of hard if you ask me, considering his life and their lives are all in danger right now. So we called the SWAT team and any ATF agents who might be around, who came and defused that package as well. Inside was another letter and another discussing a major war on their hands, and this one even took credit for the bomb that killed Robert Vance, Robert Robinson, and countless victims of the 11th Circuit Court. Of course, Walter was so convinced that his plan would be carried out in full that he didn't suspect that the 11th Circuit Court bomb would be defused and they'd have that letter, packaging, and construction to use against him. Now, what else did they have against him? Of course, he was smart, but not too smart. Due to the fact that he covered the entire bomb in thick black paint, he thwarted any sort of evidence that could link him to the packages. Also, I'm going to play devil's advocate, but let's just give a shadow of a doubt. Sure, they knew who Walter Moody Jr. was, but who's to say that he is the one who made the bombs themselves? From doing research on the case, I found that he's not the only person who used welding techniques on bombs to create a more violent explosion. Just because one person did it and got caught for it doesn't mean that someone else can't use that same knowledge to make their own. They were all identical, yes. Even the packaging was identical aside from the intended target's addresses and the supposed sender's addresses. It's almost like they were carbon copies of each other. But the one thing that they didn't count for was the addresses themselves. They also found a fingerprint on one of the letters that was thankfully preserved that didn't match anyone else in any of the federal databases that they could find. Upon closer examination, the ATF and FBI had found that the addresses were typed using a typewriter, but this typewriter wasn't fresh out of the factory, and there was literally one difference that gave them more information. That evidence was the actual number 1. That typewriter was serviced at one time, and the number 1 key had been replaced by another one that was not identical to the one that the unit originally came with. From there, they started looking into different documents that were sent to the 11th Circuit Court, as that was a primary target. So after searching tens of thousands of documents and exhausting every effort that they could at just trying to find one out of place 1 in the letters, they finally found a match. And that match came from a man by the name of Robert O'Farrell, who is a junk dealer in Enterprise, Alabama. The documents were sent to the 11th Circuit Court, filed under an insurance dispute. Obviously, insurance disputes really suck, and it's kind of a pain in the ass to go through, but why would this man want to bomb the NAACP offices and the 11th Circuit Court just because of an insurance dispute? That's what they were about to find out. The FBI, ATF, and Alabama State Patrol headed to O'Farrell's property, which was vast and expansive, and it looked like it was somewhere you could very easily find every tool at your disposal to make these kinds of explosives. There were pipes, welding torches, and was the sort of place that any tinkering expert or bomb constructor could find the tools that they needed to finally get their revenge. But he allowed them to search his property, and they found no explosives, no sort of any signifying evidence to him being behind the pipe bombs. But the one piece of evidence that they were looking for more than anything, they also couldn't find. That was the typewriter. The typewriter had been sold by Robert's daughter nearly a year earlier to a young woman, but she couldn't recall her name or exactly where she lived. This woman, of course, was Walter's wife, Susan. So let's get into this a little bit. Walter was abusive. Physically, emotionally, and mentally to his wife. She was nearly 20 years younger than he was, and Walter didn't talk much about what happened with his wife from nearly 20 years prior, named Hazel. But his anger towards her, and considering she was much smaller than him, worked as an intimidation factor to Walter's benefit. Walter was also very insecure about himself, and he hated the African American community, not just for what he learned while he was in prison, but also because exes of his kept burning the memories into his head. This was something that he put into his letters that he sent with the bombs. A blatant disdain of the African American community and how he felt they were getting off of charges because of their race. That's why he was sending bombs to the NAACP and the 11th Circuit Court, who oversaw some highly publicized cases at the time in which he felt that justice was not properly served. Susan was subjected to physical beatings by Walter. He would call her names such as a bitch, a slut, and a whore because he felt that she was having a fling with the next door neighbor. This couldn't have been further from the truth. But at one point they got into a heated argument in which Walter had knocked her down to the floor and pinned her down under his legs, then proceeded to grab both sides of her head with his palms and smash her head against the floor. But when she wasn't subjected to verbal and physical beatings, Susan was Walter's little errand girl. They would drive all around Alabama, Florida, and Georgia, acquiring parts that they needed to manufacture these bombs. He would send her into hardware stores to get things such as lead pipes, nails, coal black enamel, and other things. He would also frequent places like electronic shops for wires. Sometimes he would head to a gun shop to acquire his smokeless gunpowder, and of course, light bulbs for the filaments and some C-cell batteries. But as this was all televised, Walter stopped manufacturing the bombs and started cleaning up any evidence that could possibly link him to the bombs themselves. He constructed everything inside of an office. usually gowned up like some sort of a hazmat technician, often wearing gloves, a shower cap, and cleanroom suits that would hide any sort of residue or forensic evidence that could be used against him. He often made his bombs on a table, but covered the table in plastic sheeting as well as the floor. When the bombs would be made, he would take all the items that he didn't use and destroyed them in a burn barrel that he had out back on his property. With the information from Lloyd about his recollection of the bomb that went off back in 1972, they managed to track down Walter and Susan to their home in Rex, Georgia. While they were there, they underwent questioning by the authorities and thorough searches of the property. They found literally no shred of evidence that could link them to the bombings. They couldn't even find the typewriter. But luckily, Susan was tired of being beaten by Walter and the constant surveillance by the FBI and the ATF. This woman got into a relationship with Walter, not knowing what kind of monster that he harbored beneath his skin. That's when she had finally decided to speak out, load up her Volkswagen, and head as far away as possible that she could from that man. When she spoke with the ATF and FBI, she stated that she was acting out of fear. The beatings were violent, often leading to Susan having to wear sunglasses to mask either black eyes that Walter had given her or her eyes from sobbing so much. She wanted to give them exactly what they wanted, and she had testified that Walter was indeed the infamous mail bomber. She talked about how they would drive all around the southeastern United States, getting the supplies that they needed to make the bombs. She even told them about how they indeed bought the typewriter from Robert O'Farrell's daughter about a year prior. She confessed that she was the one who would type out the letters because she said that Walter was not as proficient as her at typing. As for the typewriter itself, it had been disposed of weeks prior, and the letters lay dormant for months before they were sent, with the bombs, to their intended targets. But one thing came up again: the fingerprint that was on one of the letters. It wasn't Walter or Susan's fingerprint. Susan had stated that the original copies of the letters were destroyed, but they had made copies of it to send to the targets. The authorities already knew this, but she had told them that on a trip to Ohio one time, they stopped at a small office shop in Florence, Kentucky, and bought the brown wrapping paper, cardboard boxes, and had taken Xerox copies of all of the letters. But while she was making copies, the Xerox machine actually ran out of paper, so Susan had alerted the attendant who came to refill the copy machine. And when he did, he left his fingerprint on the top sheet of paper, which was the next in line to be used. She didn't think of that, and honestly, it was for the better outcome. She described the name and location of the place in which the FBI sent agents to Florence to question anyone who was working there. They couldn't tell them exactly what was going on, but they told the employees that there was an ongoing investigation and that they needed to get fingerprints of anyone who might be working in there. And with that, they had finally found their match, which corroborated all of Susan's testimony. Susan gave him this testimony under the premise that she harbored no ill intent against Walter's targets, and she would testify against him in exchange for immunity. Now, with this information and evidence, on July 11th of 1990, they arrested Walter and charged him with various counts stemming from sending explosives in the mail, manufacturing of explosive devices, to first-degree premeditated murder, and the murder of a federal judge. The reasoning behind him killing Judge Robert Vance was that he was the one who had denied him the federal lawsuit against the sheriff's office, who he thought was prosecuting him with malicious intent. They stated that during the trial, there would be no 11th Circuit Court judges that would preside over the case, as the man that they were trying for the charges had killed their former associate, Robert Vance. But during the prosecution's closing statements, one quote really struck a high note with the jury. Prosecuting attorney for the state, Howard Shapiro, had stated, quote, "He sends the bombs to make the points he wants to make. He sends a bomb, or prepares to a man who repossesses his car for $100. Is it going to bother him that he doesn't even know who Robert Robinson was? Will he hesitate for a moment to take that life for no reason other than his own scheme? He also went on to say, "You have had a lot of time to look at him. You've had a lot of time to hear him. You've had a lot of time to evaluate him. Do you doubt for a second that he wouldn't do that? There's no doubt, ladies and gentlemen. There's no doubt about that whatsoever." End quote. The jury deliberated for nearly 2 days, and on June 28th of 1991, after a year of investigations and trial, they finally came back with their verdict. That day, Walter Leroy Moody Jr. was found guilty on 71 counts and sentenced to 7 life sentences behind bars. But when later tried by the state of Alabama for the murder of a federal judge, he was handed down the death penalty. In a closing statement with the judge who presided over the case, Walter was given the opportunity to address the court. In one of his final statements to the judge and jury who just handed down his punishment, he said, quote, "Your Honor, I'd like to say that the culpability regarding this matter lies with me in its entirety. Susan's participation was unwilling participation and primarily the result of psychological coercion by me. I'd ask the court to direct whatever punishment is so due to Susan to me instead." End quote. The judge replied with, "All right, that's the first admirable thing I have heard you say." Helen Vance, the widow of Robert Vance, had said, quote, "I feel like justice has been done, and that is a good feeling." End quote. Walter was held in a federal penitentiary in Alabama for the duration of his sentencing, considering there he was now on death row. He would grow old, tired. He tried to do some shitty Ponzi schemes while he was behind bars, which also failed spectacularly. It would be nearly 27 years that he awaited his execution, at first being told that he would be sentenced to death by the electric chair. In the meantime, we had given up on using that as an execution method. But after having a meal of 2 Philly cheesesteak sandwiches, 2 cans of Dr. Pepper, and a handful of M&Ms, Walter Leroy Moody Jr. was executed via lethal injection on April 18th of 2018 and was pronounced dead at 8:42 local time. This made him the oldest prisoner to ever be on death row in the state of Alabama and the oldest inmate ever executed in the entire United States at the age of 83 years and 26 days. Walter Leroy Moody Jr. is dead, and he left no final statement. But what does this say about revenge? As I said in my monologue for this episode, we all wonder what it's like to get revenge on someone who you think did you wrong. But could you ever see yourself going to this kind of extent to exact the same sort of pain and anguish that you may be feeling from somebody else? What would radicalize someone to not only take action against the justice system, but also to an entire race of people? Was Walter a mastermind or just a handyman hell-bent on destruction? That is not for me to decide, but I just hope that I'll never have to cover one of your cases if you decide to tip over the edge from fantasizing about revenge to finally making it a reality. But I thank you for sticking by me for this lengthy episode. It does feel good to be back, and yes, in case you're wondering, my mouth hurts from getting them fucking teeth pulled. But this case was particularly crazy, and from what I saw on an episode of Forensic Files, they left a lot of more key factors out of this man's madness, including his little trip on the water with his 3 employees. But if you would like to help the show, please consider donating to the Patreon page at patreon.com/murderandsuch, or you can visit murderandsuch.com for the links to the PayPal and the Patreon. Once again, another thank you to my new patrons, Ariella, McKenna, Emma, Jen, and Stacy for jumping on the Patreon. You guys, seriously, every one of my patrons are incredible, and I thank you guys so much for deciding that my show is actually worth $1. But thank you again. Maybe one day I'll actually be able to afford some new teeth. But But you can follow the show on Instagram, Facebook, and Twitter at Murder and Such, and you can follow me on Twitter, Instagram, Snapchat, and the PlayStation Network at Huntor27. Please, if you can, leave a 5-star review because that helps me more than you could ever imagine. I'm almost up to 400 reviews, so yay, go me! But I thank you again for being here with me, and I thank you for listening to Murder and Such. My name is Hunter, and I will talk to you soon. Take care.